So let's put those concepts together and now take a trip through a Rails app that sort of makes use of the ideas of model view controller, the ideas of how those things are reified. And then we'll go on and talk about in detail some of the individual mechanisms, especially active record, which supports the model. So what happens when a request hits the Rails app? The first thing that has to happen is that the incoming route has to be mapped to an action. And since in Rails, there may be multiple controllers corresponding to the different resources, there is a separate routing subsystem, and there's a file called routes.rb that defines what those mappings are. We'll look at some examples from that file in a moment. So for example, if I am running my app locally and I'm hitting it with this URL, the path is /movies/1, in config routes.rb, hopefully there is some pattern that says what to do when the route matches that HTTP method and that URI. And for example, a line in that file might look something like this. It might say that if I see get/movies and then there's a wildcard parameter ID, that should map to the movies controller and the show action. How did I know that? Because one of the convention over configuration aspects of Rails is that it names controllers, views, models. Basically, it infers the names of things and the paths by the way that you select the names initially. So if I say movies #show, that is essentially a shorthand for, in the controllers directory, look for a movies controller. And when you find it, within the class movies controller, look for a method or what's called a controller action named show. Now, again, everything that I'm showing you is overridable. If you have a good reason to have a route that maps differently, you can absolutely do that. But Rails is opinionated, meaning that to the extent that you can get your app to more or less fit the framework, there's a lot less code you have to write. Right? There's no other file anywhere that has to explicitly specify this mapping. Rails infers it. Then what happens? The controller has an action, the code block that's associated with each method, and that action can look at the parameters, and it can set instance variables that will be visible to the views. So very similar to how this worked in Sinatra. And the controller action will eventually render a view. Again, very similar to what happens in Sinatra. The differences are that the way we find that view is that the subdirectories and the file names under the views directory of your app will match the controller and action names. So again, we were in the movies controller. That means that there's going to be a view subdirectory named movies, and that's where the view is going to be found. And what controller action did we just fire? We just fired the show action. So Rails will look for a template whose root file name matches that action. Again, this is all overridable, but if your app works well and conforms to the defaults, all of this happens without you having to put any configuration information anyplace. That's why it's called convention over configuration. The conventions are basically a set of agreements saying, if you name things in a certain way, Rails as a framework will do a bunch of work for you so that you don't have to set up explicit mappings. And this is one of the simplest examples of it. And as we said, the controller action can set instance variables. So here we have the controller setting an instance variable M. And we see that in the ERB part of the view, it is dereferencing M. And just like in Sinatra, since I just said a few minutes ago that controllers inherit from a particular class provided by Rails, but views inherit from a different class provided by Rails, how is it that setting a controller instance variable in the controller action will cause that to be visible in a completely different class on the other side of the universe when the view is rendered? And the answer is Rails does it this way because it makes it nice to program. Yes, it absolutely violates object-oriented orthodoxy that instance variables sort of only belong to a single class. Rails basically does the work that when the view is instantiated, it will magically receive a set of instance variables that happen to be identical to the ones that were set up by the corresponding controller method, just because it makes life nice. So again, very similar to Sinatra. So this sort of illustrates two aspects of the Rails philosophy: convention over configuration and don't repeat yourself. Convention over configuration just means if you agree to follow certain conventions in the naming, then you eliminate the need for a lot of configuration files. So for example, in the routes subsystem, the name of the route basically tells us which controller to look for, what directory that controller is going to be in, what's the name of the method within that controller that should be fired, and ultimately, what's the view that the controller action will expect to render. Every one of those things can be overridden when necessary, but if you do nothing, this is what happens, because this is such a common case. The other sort of philosophical point is don't repeat yourself, which is any important piece of information about the app should live in exactly one place. So in this case, one example is that the routes info lives in a single file. If you need to change the mapping between a URI and a route, there's one place in which you do that. Now, from what I've shown so far, it might not be obvious why that's such a huge advantage. But when we talk about HTML forms, we're going to see that when you design a form, that form is going to submit to the server. That means that there has to be a controller action somewhere that expects to receive the content filled in on that form. And the same mechanism that the routes subsystem uses to map incoming URIs to the right action is also the mechanism that's used when you create a form to indicate where that form should submit to. So instead of saying this form should submit to the following URI, you end up saying something like, this form should submit to the update action of the movies controller because the form contains information that will update an existing movie record. And then if you end up having to change that mapping, you change it in only one place and everything else still works. You don't have to ripple the change through the rest of the app. So those are examples of convention over configuration and drying out the app. We will see many more examples, and I will try to call attention to them each time one of them comes up by having these handy dandy little icons.